OG Rose, and today we're going to continue reading from Belonging Again II.1. We are going to be in Chapter 4, Section 3, and we reflected on Cadell's fantastic book, Systems and Subjects, which you should pick up. Highly suggest, and he has a number of conversations about the book on his channel, Philosophy Portal. And today we're going to be talking about a childlike faithful presence for negentropy in zones of unknowability. And this will be section 3 of chapter 4 of book 1 of Belonging Again II.1. Richard Boothby, in his lecture on Lacan and Das Ding, given October 18th, 2023 at Philosophy Portal, noted how we might approach the gods as a mode by which the real is revealed. Religions then mark out zones of not understanding on which our lives depend, like a space of free speech. We cannot understand everything, and yet our lives are deeply impacted and shaped by what we cannot understand. All we can do is make our sacrifice and hope for the best, as Dr. Boothby put it. Similarly, perhaps we cannot fully understand childhood or why some people become mentidivergent while others fall under affliction. Perhaps it will always be a mystery why exactly some people are intrinsically motivated and others aren't, as it might always be a mystery for why we seem essentially lacking and capable of self-effacement, as it might always be strange that we can be river holes and white boxes, and those are terms alluding back to Cadell's fantastic book. But we don't need to fully understand these phenomenon, only trace out zones or situations, pointing to Leibniz, in which the likelihood of their emergence and happening is higher. We might not know why in one cave prisoners are less likely to leave on their own, while in another cave they are more likely to leave. But if we can at least observe a difference between these caves, we will see a way to approach the problem of scale and spread, which so deeply concerns us in Belonging Again. And note, I'm editing as I read and will not be editing this video, so forgive me for that. The True Isn't the Rational by O.G. Rose will indeed attempt describing why we can leave Plato's cave on our own in more detail, and what kind of subjects we must be, and in what kind of reality, so this might be possible. But here observing a difference between the caves, AA, and zones, AB, would be enough. Not that I always hold to that language, but we will here. In what environment or meta-architecture are we more likely to see an emergence of mentidivergence, attention, AB, and children? Under what conditions? What might the zones look like around the unknowability, which we must choose to interpret as either a pure nothingness or apophatic mystery, thus possibly making ourselves openings in which negentropy might enter the universe? Are there zones which might inspire ever more people to courageously make absolute choices? What many are calling the liminal web online might be seen as a zone, which may or may not be conditions in which people can become different kinds of subjects who are perhaps more AB than AA. Now, we're going to later move toward the language of the social coordination mechanism instead of the liminal web. But here we use that language. And the liminal web even if we don't fully understand why it works or how, giving us reason to attempt word spread regardless, as we'll explain later. As I will attempt to show, I think we can find reason to believe something like the liminal web has worked historically and led to profound socioeconomic change, what Dietrich McCloskey calls the Great Enrichment. And we'll talk about her later in this book. And furthermore, there is reason to believe that systems don't take care of themselves, that they are all ultimately abyssal, and thus everything rides on a human element and contingency, mainly the nature and conditioning of our subjectivity. What that means is that ultimately all systems are going to rely on something that cannot be systemized, a point of incompleteness where the human stands. Now, that isn't, but the trick is, the problem is that the system that the human is in can train their subjectivity to function like the system when the system ultimately will depend on something outside the logic, internal to it. And that becomes a real issue. To resume reading. Are we under affliction, AA, or capable of attention, AB? Language we will use later in this book is discourse and rhetoric. And then in 2.2, we'll talk about Kafka likeness and voicecraft, with affliction aligning with discourse, while attention aligns with rhetoric. And so we will be asking, do the zones of our world incubate affliction discourse or attention rhetoric? Our answer to this will suggest what kind of subjects we are helping birth into the world, upon which the question of if we might spread childhood rides. Much rests on how we relate to lack and nihilism, RSI, the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Discourse is the zeitgeist, which spreads affliction, AA, while rhetoric is the art which spreads attention. And the spread of rhetoric and attention requires a deconstruction of the subject and object divide into a world where we see system subjects, which means we must arrive at a new concept of the subject and of system. This would be for us to spread childhood and honor Nietzsche, but here I would like to take a moment to address what David McCarricker tells us in Time Energy, mainly that Nietzsche is not our friend. Though we are mainly framing our investigation as spreading childhood, Nietzsche couldn't care less that the working class or average person gained leisure, childhood, or what McCarricker calls time energy. Nietzsche knew, like Marx, that leisure time was the basis of all qualified culture, which is required if we are to gain zones of unknowability with which childhood might be cultivated. But arguably, Nietzsche sought to hoard leisure for the few at the expense of the many. Nietzsche was even ready to enslave the third world if needed, writing on the West, striving for leisure that, and I quote, one could perhaps think of satisfying his desires in massively introducing barbaric Asian and African populations so that the civilized world continues to use the services of the uncivilized. What Nietzsche wrote was wrong. Yes, but then McCarricker makes an important point. Nietzsche is actually onto something. At least Nietzsche owns up to the reality of the situation. Nietzsche comes right out and tells us what the objective situation is, taking the side of the parasites rather than the easy way out. Many of us in the West rely on labor and slaves for our standard of living while acting like we do not. And in this way, perhaps Nietzsche is more honest. This doesn't make what Nietzsche wrote moral, but have we found a way yet to sustain our standard of living without relying on a working class that is drained of all time energy, to use McCarricker's phrase? This suggests why the problem of spreading childhood is so pressing, even if Nietzsche himself seems to have thought it was impossible. Hence, for Nietzsche, the reliance of children on slaves. In this way, to consider the spread of childhood is to consider something Nietzsche himself may not have considered. For Nietzsche, there was no way to spread childhood. Considering the question might have been a fool's errand. If so, we will be fools. If we cannot spread childhood, then we might be stuck with Nietzsche in a way that resonates with Daniel Tutt's work, which asks us to consider Nietzsche not as a friend and co conspirator, but as a parasite, which is to basically say that Nietzsche is an elitist whose project requires a working class deprived of time energy to sustain those elites. Nietzsche fights and resists equality and socialist tendencies, which isn't to cancel Nietzsche, but instead to take seriously the difficulty of egalitarian leisure at scale. This is fair, for indeed, I do not think Nietzsche provides us thinking on how we might address the problem of scale in spreading childhood, and indeed, Nietzsche seems to accept a slave class as necessary for sustaining elite children, as Tutt and McCarricker point out. If we are to say this is wrong of Nietzsche, then I believe it is our responsibility to show and argue for an alternative that doesn't fall into totalitarianism, discourse, and or affliction. That is the attempt of belonging again part 2, which is the effort of addressing belonging again part 1. I don't know if time energy can actually be reclaimed in mass. What McCarricker writes here is what I feel about childhood in mass, but I resonate with what McCarricker tells us next. I genuinely fear for and feel a terrible sadness for all the hundreds of millions of children who are, on a daily basis, told they cannot explore their interests and hone talent for its own sake, who are told that they are inferior and destined to failure if they can't force themselves to care about the arbitrary interests of others from period to period all day, every day, from week to week for decades. Nietzsche might give us childhood, but not the resources to spread his childhood to all children. To provide that is what we will attempt. We must. Nobody reads. If nobody can really read, then who cares if books are censored? They're wasted on us. If they are not to be wasted on us, we must resist the desire to be intelligible and understood. For example, for this is when we cease to strive not to be defined by identitarian categories, but instead want recognition from some big others. And I've been quoting McCarrick's book, Time Energy, which I highly suggest. This is for us to follow discourse instead of rhetoric, to give up useless space, which make useless spaces which make possible a delusion line of flight that we might say we want, but receiving proves terrifying and something we can then try to disown. If we seek belonging in definability, we risk failing in our effort to belong again in a new way. In this insane world where nobody belongs, we are to belong in a way which negates sublates old ways. We are to belong and find meaning in childhood. We have a need to feel like we belong, but that need today is not being met or is being fed by the junk food of tribalism, capture, ideology, or the like. We also have a need to feel like we are becoming better at things and giving back to our community, hence the need for training, gymnasiums, and childhood in general. To Change the World by Dr. James Hunter, and I really suggest this book. I think it's an important book. Can be seen, which it's a very important book for people to read who are interested in this question of real culture and social transformation and how one goes about it and what it means. And I really think Dr. James Hunter is an important thinker, and he's done a lot for over the years. To Change the World by Dr. James Hunter can be seen as his own address to the sociological realities he saw unfolding, as he famously described in coining the term culture war and in channeling the work of thinkers like Peter Berger and Philip Rieff. The book is interested in how religious faith might be possible in the late modern world, which also explores how do believers live out their faith under the conditions of the late modern world. Hunter is mostly examining how Christianity can influence and participate in culture, which leads him to broader understandings of how culture is shaped at all. Everything hinges on how we understand the nature of culture, he writes, and the hope of belonging again, part one, was to provide that understanding, which is to say, if we do not understand the tension and interplay between givens and releases, we cannot move forward. Hunter discusses the importance of values, ideas, and choices in shaping cultures, but where in culture these values, ideas, and choices reside is central. Many Christians try to shape culture through evangelism from the ground up, but Hunter does not see the historic evidence for this proving effective. Christians cannot just tell people about Christianity if they are to change culture, as children cannot just tell people to be children. Sure, children might have values, ideas, and choices which could help us transcend affliction, but none of that culture of childhood will necessarily go anywhere. More is needed. And I think Hunter really helps us see how culture spreads. Like, it is not merely telling people or handing out information. It's not really information. Um, it is much more modeling. It's much more being in a place of influence and power while modeling an alternative that kind of allows that alternative to then kind of move through the system. Um, there is something more that we need to think in terms of formation versus information. And of course, James K. Smith is good on that as well. To resume, Hunter emphasizes that culture is changed through institutions, networks of influence, systems of power, and the like, and grassroots and ground up efforts only prove effective to the degree they move into those areas. If children want to change the culture, they must move into places where they influence cultural production and cultural capital, and then prove faithfully present in those spaces, to use Hunter's invaluable terminology. If Christians emphasize all these areas as sinful, they might think it holy not to seek faithful presence, which for Hunter is problematic, for this thinking is for Christians to give up the culture, as it would also be for children. Hunter makes another key observation. Interestingly, the emphasis on values, choice, and spiritual renewal has also predisposed nearly everyone to focus on politics as the central means of changing the world. The reasoning goes like this: bad law is the outcome of bad choices made by individual politicians, judges, and policymakers. Thus, changing the world requires the individual Christians vote. That individual Christians vote into office those who hold the right values or possess the right worldview and therefore will make the right choices. like Hunter's own work does. Belonging Again, Part 1 hopefully made clear why this is a terrible mistake, which will likely cause pluralism to undergo self-effacement, such as in Equality and Its Immoral Limits, which is the paper. To win at politics is to win at force, and this will not be to change hearts and minds. Robert George is right that law teaches, and if Christians change the law to make it favor them, this could help teach us that Christianity is good, but then we will attempt to stimulate culture with law versus create culture, a distinction we will elaborate on when we discuss Keynes. And not only will this favor affliction and discourse, perhaps arising to a Christian affliction, horrifyingly enough, but it means every election will be a battle for who is able to softly nudge people in the direction of their worldview. In this world, thinkers like Dugin seem validated. Is that what we want? Where creating culture is overlooked or de emphasized, power can run in to fill the void. And those values And those values and choices would seem to be the opposite of politics, and ironically, without culture, they can become captured by politics and power. This seems to be what happens when we are disabled by discourse and the zeitgeist, as Ivan Illich will discuss, and so disabled we cannot make culture, only employ power and law to change the world into what we want it to be. Now, I'm not saying politics and law are bad. They have an incredibly important role. The question is, at what point do they overfit? Which, of course, nobody knows the answer ahead of time, hence, you need a constant system of testing and all that. Um, but how we change the world changes how the world changes, and if we change it through a means of discourse, affliction, and AA, so the world will be captured and not changed as we think it does. Discourse will seem challenged as it prevails. Dr. Hunter, in chapter 1 of his book, considers the conservative Christian perspective of changing the world and making a case for why it is entirely and makes a case for why it is entirely mistaken in chapter 2, which has implications for spreading childhood. He argues that there is no necessary correlation between the size of a community and its influence. As David Hollinger has shown, for example, the contribution of the Jewish community to science, literature, art, music, letters, film, and architecture is both brilliant and unrivaled. And these contributions were made in a context often defined by open, aggressive, and malicious anti Semitism. And yet, the evangelical strategy suggests that cultural influence is tied to community size. Please note, Jewish communities suggest the primacy of culture, a point Malcolm Collins also explores in the Pragmatic's Guide to Crafting Religion. Size doesn't necessarily hurt, of course, but it guarantees nothing, a point which can be comforting, for it means we don't need everyone to join our effort for the effort to spread childhood to change culture out of affliction. But the point is also befuddling, for if culture is not shaped by size, what changes it? Failures of Christians to shape culture can be interpreted by conservatives and the right as Christians are just not trying hard enough, acting decisively enough, or believing thoroughly or Christianly enough. The same could be said of children. No, this is wrong. An ineffective strategy won't work no matter how hard we try. But the more it fails, the more Christians are blamed, for the burden of responsibility and action resides with the individual Christian, and it is up to them to be better and do more to change the world. This is a recipe for pathology, tribalism, and paranoia, and it can lead to hopelessness, nihilism, and even deconstruction. Ironically, the Christian effort to change the world can thus lead to a dissolving of Christianity. The same could happen with childhood via an emphasis on being more childlike, mentidivergent, philosophical, if we are not careful. Where does this notion of cultural change come from that Hunter sees as so erroneous? It's always fun to review a book and just find the mistakes, the grammar mistakes. Oh, it's fun. Well, it aligns with what we often find in conservatism, which tends to support capitalism. And I quote, the model of culture change on offer implicitly operates within the framework of a market popularism. Change comes through the random aggregation of individual actions and choices in a free market of options. What matters for the Christian in this approach to culture is entering into the marketplace with the creation of new cultural goods. The direction and purpose and coherence of cultural creation matters less because in the end, it will be the market that determines what succeeds or fails. This is simplistic. It is not necessarily the case that the best ideas prevail in the end. It is the ideas which faithfully reside in systems of influence and power. Faithful presence is a key concept to Hunter's thinking and basically argues that Christians need to make their way into places of power and influence and prove faithful to the values and ideas of Christianity in those spaces. In this way, Hunter is not saying that ideas don't matter, but that it also matters where ideas are, and if they are not found in networks of influence, they cannot change the culture. Ideas deeply matter, but which ideas deeply matter depends on where the ideas are present. Now, of course, the great problem is as you enter into a place of influence, the very place you are in changes your habits and has an impact on how you think. So, how do you enter a space with X values and not be trained out of those values by the very entering? This is the $1 million problem and something that hopefully the social coordination mechanism can help with. Everything Hunter argues regarding Christians applies just as well to children. And Hunter is not arguing that Christians need power, if by that we mean gain political sway, but that Christians need to faithfully be where power is found as Christians. Likewise, those who happen to be children right now, for reasons we might not yet understand, are those who will need to move into places of influence and faithfully be children if the culture is to shift in a direction that might spread childhood. If this is what is required to overcome the meta crisis and the great stagnation, then this is a matter of great socio-political consequence. If a failure to spread intrinsic motivation will lead to social collapse, then children reaching places of cultural influence and faithfully being children, which will not be easy, please note, and easily require training, say through classes at Philosophy Portal, Voicecraft, Theory Underground, Other Life, Parallax, is a matter of great and dire consequence. But what does that mean, and how might we go about it? Indeed, those are the questions which the problem of scale must take up. If we don't like what Nietzsche wrote, that David McCarricker rightly critiqued, I think it is our responsibility to answer Nietzsche with a way to spread childhood, a counter response, which Nietzsche might have happily received if he thought it was possible. The response will require us to create conditions of zones of unknowability, as only possible if children are faithfully present in networks of influence, which are zones of girdle points in which essential incompleteness can no longer be denied. Plausible deniability has run out. This is where a river hole is possible and mentidivergence could emerge to address rational impasses. I say Nash equilibria here, but I've been speaking with Marcus, and I think I'm using it too imprecisely and too freely. I think it would be better just to say rational impasses, because that's what I mean anyway, and I am in Marcus's debt for the correction. I think rational impasses is better to emphasize. This is where now I would say that rational impasses are Nash equilibria, as I understand it. But from a game theoretic standpoint, it's possible for Nash equilibria that aren't really so much rational impasses, and so I think that's a very important point. So I'm going to say just rational impasses. This is where attention, maybe, although of course in other videos and other conversations, I would say Nash equilibria more freely. Um, but anyway, this is where attention AB can break through affliction AA, but at risk of great pathology and self-effacement. But this is a risk we must prepare for given the loss of givens and approach of the technological singularity. We must ready ourselves now, but how? Sure, we can know that we need to spread the conditions in which people can leave Plato's cave on their own, but that doesn't mean we know how to socially. And even if we do come up with a method, do we have any historic evidence to believe it will work versus hopeful speculation, which risks oppression and totalitarianism? I think so, which will bring us to Dietrich McCloskey, who gave us confidence that a faithful presence in zones of unknowability, who can give us confidence that a faithful presence in zones of unknowability, which incubate childhood, is a sound strategy. And also for Marcus's work, do check out the Econ Playground. It's a fantastic channel, and his writings are wonderful with Hingley. If we fail in this effort, the alternative is something I fear affliction and discourse would have us try as a solution, and our only option, which will ultimately only benefit affliction and discourse, mainly some model of central planning using artificial intelligence, as we might already see in China. Um, but I would turn to Michelle Bowens for that judgment. In Critical Mass, Philip Ball discusses how tools, methods, and ideas initially developed to understand how the blind material fabric of the universe behaves are now finding application in arenas for which they were never designed. Can physics help us predict and plan? suggesting we don't need preparation? Can science provide a theoretical framework which underpins contemporary physics and yet can also help us with problems like traffic flows, to how the economy fluctuates and how businesses are organized? Or does that suggest a hubris that has caused the world so much trouble and contributed so profoundly to affliction and discourse? I do not support this AA thinking, but if the world begins to fall apart, we become desperate, and this kind of thinking is all we have, it will be what we employ. Better to try something than do nothing, right? And so we will try. After all, if people are smothered down to billiard balls interacting through mathematically defined forces, and that saves us all, shouldn't we be grateful? I'm not saying Philip Ball necessarily supports this, but at the same time, I can't blame him if he does, if we have no alternatives to offer, similar to how Nietzsche has a point we might not like to hear. The more urgent question to which the physics of society can contribute, Ball writes, is whether we can construct a society blessed with wisdom and compassion that others, often in harsher or more difficult times, were able to glimpse and to demand. I think it can to the degree it contributes to childhood, yes, but I don't think physics can replace childhood without worsening affliction. To Ball's defense, he doesn't seem to think that way either. Well, he doesn't think that way. A push and pull, a tension between conflicting desires. This is this is all it takes to tip our social behavior into complex and often unpredictable patterns dictated by influences beyond our immediate experience or ability to control. Regardless of what we believe about the motions for individual behavior, once we become part of a group, we cannot be sure what to expect. Ball tells us that the physics of society is and can only be a tool, never a moral compass. Ball is not naive, and I cannot blame him for turning to physics in a world many philosophers have left all the practical work to scientists and engineers. And he's a fascinating thinker. That's this book is one of his earlier books, but the stuff he's doing now is extraordinary. But we must try a different approach, for childhood cannot be engineered without risking oppression, and totalitarianism only incubated in the right conditions which must have the possibility of failing or else they will oppress. These are human conditions. These are zones of processing unknowability and must be scaled if the conditions in which childhood can be incurated are to spread and increase the mentidivergent divergence, which possibly enables more people to leave Plato's cave on their own and avoid more attention. Enables more people and avoid through attention the rational impasse of affliction. This will require a faithful presence of children in places of influence amidst the loss of givens and in preparation for the technological singularity. But that will prove effective only to the degree these children understand how best to approach the problem of scale. And so to that problem we will now turn. And that will end book 1 of Belonging Again. II.1, we will next start with book 2, The Problem of Scale, part 1. For Belonging Again, check out Amazon. You can get part 1 there, an explanation, and also part 2. And thank you so much for your time. All purchases and reviews are deeply, deeply appreciated. And thank you so much for your time. And there's a playlist with everything we've recorded so far that can be found on YouTube. All the best.